Peter is here with us today to address civil society networks as a strategy to address conflict prevention deadlocks. And he's with the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, an organization I've been familiar with for about 10 years now. I consider it a global action network. So welcome, Peter. Would you like to start by giving us a little bit of more knowledge about who you are and how you came to be involved in this issue and the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict that we will call GPPAC, so we don't have to say that all the time.
Sure. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everybody, wherever you are. And thanks, Steve, for setting that up. And sorry for the slight glitches in the beginning. My name is Peter van Tuijl. I am a Dutch national, currently based in The Hague, in the Netherlands. About my background and how I guess I grew up professionally in a civil society network focused on Indonesia in the 1980s and 1990s. Very early days of what became known as transnational civil society networking. There's many things I could tell about that, but we'll leave that for now. The point is just that, you know, I have quite a lot of experience in working with these networks. I moved on and worked for NoVIP, what is now Oxfam NoVIP, as a senior advisor on these issues. NoVIP was funding a lot of advocacy-oriented networks and efforts, and I worked on problem-solving, capacity development, evaluations, etc. Then I worked and lived for 7 years in Indonesia. I worked for the UN, and I worked for the US Department of Justice, mostly on the reform of the Indonesian National Police. That is another whole story and another webinar. But what it led to is, because there's not many people in civil society with a background in civil society that have inside experience with security sector reform. So I was looking for sort of an opportunity to combine that. And that's how I ended up with an organization which in those days was still called the European Center for Conflict Prevention, which we later on renamed into the GPPAC Foundation, because ECCP was the convener of the GPPAC network, as Steve well knows. And thanks for this opportunity, Steve. I'm a great admirer of Steve's work, of the energy that it has, and the serious attempt to think in integrated ways about complex problems. And Steve knows that I do not always agree with him, but it's a person I like to disagree with, because it is so. The spirit of work is always so enjoyable. So I'm very grateful to you, Steve, and thanks for everybody to take the time to listen to my presentation.
Thanks, Peter, for making time for being with us. I'd just like to let Mark Clark, who has joined us, to introduce himself. Mark, we already did a round of introductions, but I'd like to bring you into the meeting. If you could just introduce yourself a little bit.
Yes, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm joining you from Egypt on a very slow internet connection, so I hope it's okay. My name's Mark Clark. I am the CEO of Generations for Peace, which is an international non-profit peace-building organization based in Amman, Jordan, but supporting volunteer-led peace-building activities at grassroots level in communities. We have volunteers in 50 countries in the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, and the Balkans. So it's really a pleasure to join, and I'm very interested in GPPAC and looking forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Would you like me to move the slides then, Mark? Peter?
Sure. Okay, so this is what I thought I would do, because I think the idea of these webinars is, of course, share experiences from today. It'll be my point of view, but my understanding is that the purpose of our discussion is really to sort of verify whether the approach, for the sake of convenience, we call it the LSE approach to large system exchange and not the London School of Economics, and to verify it, to check like how relevant is it, how useful is it. So I thought, let me talk you through the GPPAC experience, and in doing that, sort of make remarks, comments, ask a few questions for discussion also when it comes to the large systems approach. So please, if you move on to the next slide. So first, of course, a short introduction about GPPAC. GPPAC, Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, is a global network of civil society organizations focused on conflict prevention and peace building. For partly historical, partly practical reasons, we are constituted regionally. So what you see here in this map in the different colors is 15 regional networks, and the global secretariat is in The Hague. So I'm the director of the global hub of the network. As an organization, we are not large. And my office has 16 staff at the moment, people from all over the world. And we have in every region a regional coordination point where usually there is one person working most of the time designated for the network, sometimes not even full time. We are a network, so we don't open offices everywhere. We work with and through our member organizations. What we do, a lot of our members are involved, of course, in on-the-ground efforts to try and prevent conflict or build peace. So a lot of our members are involved in local dialogue and mediation processes, in conflict analysis, early warning, bringing that information to governments, to regional organizations. In some regions, members are involved in things like peace education and need also more voluntary efforts. A network is, of course, not a neatly streamlined organization. It is uneven, it is wobbly, and that is fine as far as I'm concerned. And what we do in the Global Secretariat is we provide a number of generic backup services for our members in terms of information, communication, planning, monitoring, evaluation, relations with donors, of course, but also what is very important is a network has horizontal and vertical functions. So we organize a lot of the horizontal exchange, that's a key element in networking. Bring the story of what civil society in Kenya did after the post-election violence in 2008 and bring that to Kyrgyzstan or to Guatemala or wherever. Those are things that have a lot of added value. And looking at it more vertically, of course, we try to connect the local to regional and global levels of policy and decision making. So we also help opening up the doors with regional organizations and with the United Nations. We have a liaison officer in New York, also based in with one of our members. And we do a lot of work with regional organizations because if you look at this map, you'll understand that our network in Southeast Asia has an almost automatic click with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the ASEAN. In West Africa, ONEP works intensively with ECOWAS, and East Africa with the Great Lakes Conference, the African Union, the League of Arab States, OSCE, OES in Latin America. Okay, these are all things, of course, that I can tell a lot more about, but anyway, I just wanted to give you a very quick bird's eye view of what GPPAC is. There is about 200 organizations, more or less involved. The network, of course, has sort of inner and broader circles. It's a bit like throwing a stone in a lake where you see the circles of different levels of intensity. We are financially supported by some government and some private foundations. As I said, as an organization, we are not a multi-million-dollar big NGO or so. We are a relatively lean and small network organization.
Peter, behind the foundation of GPPAC, I understood, was the insight about what you're going to talk about really today, I think, which is the role of civil society that could have, rather than leaving everything up to government as the sort of thinking they're the ones that are supposed to handle the armed conflict.
Right. And of course, it is all based on the, this is, if you wish, a key assumption that there is a valuable role for civil society in mobilizing local constituencies, addressing local grievances, and contributing information, ideas, legitimacy to, for the sake of convenience, higher levels of policy and decision making. Do I lose your? Okay. Right. Here we come. So first, here the point I wanted to make is that, to me, which is why I also felt happy to join this series of webinars, had the slogan that we have that was sort of the lead in the founding conference of this network 10 years ago in New York, is how can we move from reaction to prevention? And so to me, this is a typical large system issue, where if I look at the definition that Steve has given in his paper, we are trying to engage a large number and variety of actors across different geographical spaces and different systems. And I take systems as more than just political systems. We're also talking about social, cultural systems, right? So it is in that sense, it is relevant, I think, to discuss the idea because causes and effects of violence are increasingly playing out across different systems and across different geographical spaces. As a matter of fact, again, I have to sort of do bird's eye views of the state of play when it comes to the knowledge at this point, but I assume that the people listening to this webinar are more or less familiar with, if I say that, well, in today's world, for example, hardly any conflict plays out within the borders of one nation state only. Almost every conflict needs to be perceived at least within a regional perspective. So if you talk about Mali, that is not just Mali, that is Niger, that is Côte d'Ivoire, that is Burkina Faso, that is Tuaregs moving around, that is criminal syndicates moving around, it is political interest defined within a regional space and beyond that. I think it is relevant to address this within the LSE perspective. Can we go to the next slide? So then, by talking you through, sort of reflecting on the large systems approach, I thought let's talk about what is our main challenge, what is at the heart of what we do, and it is why it is so difficult and sometimes frustrating to actually achieve prevention. Can you move to the next slide, Steve? Because this is really an intriguing element in my work, and there's probably some people listening to this webinar that share that experience. On the one hand, if you make the case, if you say, look, don't you agree, whether that is a government or an international organization or a private sector stakeholder, but if you say to any reasonable person, don't you agree that it makes sense to prevent violence, to prevent violent conflict, rather than try to react to it and do damage control or crisis management, then almost everyone will agree with you, right? And there is quite a lot of research, some of it a little bit slippery in my view, but then anyway, there's quite a lot of research on the cost of conflict in terms of human capital, human victims, human suffering, as well as material damage done to conflict because of conflict. There is a very interesting effort that has been created thanks to the initiative of an Australian businessman who decided to use the money that he made in IT to create an organization. And he developed the Global Peace Index. So he tweaked the argument around and he said, well, let's look at the benefits of peace. He had the resources to invest in, I think, pretty solid research. So, sorry, if you go to the website of Vision of Humanity, you can see the Global Peace Index, and they're in a more, in other words, in a more positive approach. The evidence is sort of put right in your face. It makes an awful lot of sense to prevent conflict, to work on peace, because peace benefits also, that's where he's coming from, economic development, and economic development leads to greater opportunities to establish justice and to come more to the immaterial and the normative sides of life. The next slide, please. Then that is also translated in a lot of support in international law and policies, and I'm not going to list that even. I assume that people will appreciate the argument. There is an endless list of UN Security Council, UN General Assembly, regional organizations, governmental statements, policies that will all subscribe to this principle that yes, we should work on prevention, it is important, we should make the effort, we agree. There is also, and here it becomes, I think, a little more debatable, but I would say there's actually also a lot of information available. Here you come to the question of early warning, because of course you can say, well, how can we prevent if we don't know how to, if we don't see it coming? Civil society organizations often play an important role in early warning systems that are more formalized in some parts of the world and less in other parts of the world. There is a whole debate about the relationship between early warning and early action, and here you come to my problem, why the early action is often not there. But for me, being in this work for a number of years, in my observation, the information and the early warning is usually there. I mean, we saw Libya coming, we saw Mali coming. I mean, myself, I've even gone on record before the crisis broke out again in 2012. More recently, a crisis in Burkina Faso, we saw it coming. But also, if you look at more frozen conflicts, again, I'm jumping to another piece of work that I myself am involved in. We work on the lack of peace on the Korean Peninsula, which is really a situation which in a political sense is totally stuck. Yet, you cannot say that you don't see the danger there. It is there, it is analyzed from all sides. We have a lot of information about nuclear arms, chemical arms, conventional arms available. And very little is being done for political reasons by governments to prevent this from escalation. So the information is actually also there. Can you move on, Steve? Now, what do we know, and what is sort of the agreement on how to implement prevention? there is a fair amount of agreement, let's say, in academic knowledge on conflict and in also in the political sphere that, look, nobody can do this alone. We need to collaborate, and there is the multi-stakeholder approach. Again, I'm not going to go deeply into that. I sort of assume that people are familiar with the concept. It's an idea that different stakeholders in a conflict situation, a government, the military, civil society, academia, local leadership, religious leaders, etc. You need to collaborate together. Positive forces need to coalesce in order to prevent violence. Here, that was your question in the beginning, Steve. The role of civil society on paper is very much appreciated and verified, and oh yes, civil society should participate. In practice, that is still often an issue. In my view, civil society participation is way too much ad hoc, incidental, and it is not enough institutionalized. So you often end up in this sort of broken record type of conversations where over and over you have to again explain why civil society is important and why we should sit at this negotiating table and what we have to offer and why that is relevant. That is part of the frustration, I guess. But anyway, on paper, there is an appreciation for the role of civil society.
And what do you mean?
I make a note here on you know, there is the other, I think it's coming later, there's this purple slide where you have a number of circles of the different streams of the large systems approach. For me, this was a question reflecting on what I just said, that I think, and maybe you would argue, Steve, that because there is not yet enough knowledge from the angle of a large system approach, but I find in other words, the learning capacity about large systems problems very small. And to me, this is an example that strikes me, where you see there is, on the one hand, this enormous amount of evidence that, yes, the role of civil society is important. There's an agreement. There's often a political agreement that is the case. But then in the reality and in the doing, the lessons have not been learned and, you know, need to be taught over and over again, which for me is an interesting question if I think of large system approach, how a learning loop feeds back into what ultimately has to be practice change, right? So that was a first question I would like, you know, to share with the group. Can you move on, Steve?
Just if you could explain what
Sure.
you mean by civil society, first of all, because often people have different ideas.
Sure. Okay. There's a whole debate on civil society, and for me, you know, the rough definition is that it is a sphere of organizations in between the state and the individuals, in which people gather and organize themselves for mostly normative, partly also practical purposes. So in other words, I do not see business as part of civil society. For me, that is another motivation and another level. And for me, what is also essential, that the civil society that I discuss is non-violent, is gender-friendly, because there is a whole debate about uncivil society, and you know, you can see Al-Qaeda or the Hells Angels also as a manifestation of civil society, but that's not the civil society that I'm talking about. And that's quite relevant in today's world, because the notion of uncivil society is used as a political tool to limit the space for more positive part of civil society. Does that clarify?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. So then I thought, okay, of course, this is all sort of rough summaries of like what is our proposition in large systemic terms. It's to reconnect individual, local information to regional and global processes and structures. It's about collaboration. It's about innovating relationships and influencing others. So in your framework, Steve, it's I think it's in my slideshow. It's also there's this purpley slide with these circles of influence. Here you go. It is in the social, political, economic structure sphere, trying to connect the individual, but very much based on values and beliefs, or what you call the MEMS, which is an interesting word, atmosphere. And technology is, of course, often a tool that we use. The one thing is we interact with, natural environment considerations? Yes. I mean, climate change is a very important factor causing conflict. So in an analytical sense, yes. But as a network, we do not very much participate in, let's say, the processes that are directly related to that. Can we go back to the other side or the next slide? Yeah, so I think I discussed this, and then moving on. This and then this, yeah. So then coming to and trying to share, so why is it difficult then? So if there is all this evidence and all this political support, why is it problematic to realize this ambition that everyone seems to agree with? First, what is a real problem, and I think it is something that deserves discussion in the context of trying to develop the large system approach, is there is in my view, there's an enormous fragmentation of power going on. And I think the power question, and Steve knows some of my more academic work, so you know that I'm interested in that, deserves to be put forward looking at your framework, Steve. This is very intriguing how governments, international organizations, but also actually many corporations, how power is fragmenting over much smaller entities. There is some literature on that. Moses Naim has written an interesting book that some of you may be familiar with, The End of Power, From Boardrooms to Battlefields and Churches to States, Why Being in Charge Isn't What It Used to Be. That was quite a bestseller a year ago. So he describes the rise of micropowers. You can say an individual decision can, you can say that Edward Snowden's decision to reveal massive amounts of information about the U.S. National Security Agency, that has affected U.S. power more than the rivalry between the U.S. and China. Naim has a very interesting paraphrase on one of Churchill's famous statements. He says, well, never in the field of human conflict have so few had the potential to do so much damage to so many at so little cost. And that reflects, of course, very much on the issue of radicalization, terrorism, etc., where basically one wacko can do enormous damage to a situation in a country or the government.
Peter, I'm just
so there is a power fragmentation going on, which, in other words, makes it difficult, even in the most successful multi-stakeholder approach, to have a coalition that has enough power to affect prevention. Sorry, Steve, you wanted to ask something?
Yeah, I'm thinking, I think it was in Burkina Faso, you gave the example of developing the West African capacity as a region to be able to take intervention. So I'm wondering if it's not, if looking at it from the point of view of power fragmentation is only looking at one side of the question, because it's really the reformulation of power structures. Because as I understood it in West Africa, what you have supported is part of the evolution of a new structure that to deal with the power fragmentation. Could you go into that case to give us a bit more sense of the dynamics you're talking about?
Sure. There you have that is Burkina Faso, because this of course is the question that is often asked. Okay, you're in the business of prevention. What have you prevented? Which of course in a methodological sense always poses the issue of the establishment of the counterfactual, because how do you prove that something hasn't happened? I'm sure everyone in this business can share how difficult this is to discuss with your evaluators. But I think Burkina Faso is a very interesting example where you see that the investment in a very fragile situation in building capacities at the civil society level, but also at government, parts of the government, and at the regional level in particular. The role of ECOWAS I find very interesting, because you can be skeptical about, let's say, the political quality of some of the presidents and the regime. But what you see in ECOWAS, and very recently you saw it again, there was an attempted coup by leftover supporters of the previously ousted president, Blaise Compaoré, that there is a level of effective peer pressure in ECOWAS, and that at the level of presidents of other countries, ECOWAS provides the structure to step in. That is supported. That is supported by civil society, of course. That is important, and the activity and the civil society, not only in an organized sense, but also the civil society in Burkina Faso itself. It's also people going out on the street, where the let's say the more, if you wish, NGO type of organizations flow over into social movements and young people that come out and say, look, we don't want this. This has to be retracted. We had an agreement on a way forward in this country, and where this happened about a year ago, and it happened again now, where the concerted intervention based on the legitimacy given by the local electors, but with support from the regional structures and regional civil society, and with some support, not that much in my view, but okay, we can debate the case, but some support from the West Africa Office from the United Nations, where a country is being pulled back from a potential much larger outbreak of violence. So where, in other words, you see effective conflict prevention in place.
So ECOWAS is the West African states. It's an intergovernmental organization, as I understand.
Yeah, it's informally it's a sub-regional organization.
And so the through ECOWAS, could you explain just a little bit more what you think of as the evolving, the potential evolving trajectory of the relationship between these types of new government sub-organizations and civil society?
Well, the relevant issue is the innovation of relationships and the crystallization, to approach prevention and conflict. You often need a regional approach because the national level is not enough. It doesn't cover enough causes and effects of conflicts. So it creates new possibilities and new space for civil society also. I could give you many examples where a local or national civil society may have problems in talking to its own government at home, so to say, where the door is shut for political reasons because of the nature of the government. And then if you go to a regional level or to the context of an ECOWAS organization, then all of a sudden we're in a different space, and that same civil society representative may be well possible to talk with someone from his own government representing that government in the regional framework. It's a very interesting dynamic, very interesting dynamic. So there is a new opportunity to connect some of the levels in the other slide that we were just looking at. It's a political process that relates to, of course, an issue that affects individuals ultimately and interest, but also back to values, because some of the states are captured by the wrong kind of interest or even criminal interest. I'll come to that actually later in my presentation also. So I'm trying to sort of talk to some of the problems. Another problem that we face, which is making implementing prevention difficult, is technology, media influence, the enormous dispersal of violence, and that comes back to the dispersal of power I was just referring to, and the role of performance violence. These are phenomena that are not yet very well researched, in my view, but it goes to the absurdity of someone in the U.S. With a grudge against someone killing her in front of a TV camera, filming it, putting it on Facebook, and then killing himself. I mean, it is there are new phenomena which are related to technological development and the role of social media that apparently make violence attractive in a new way for individuals, that make it more difficult to get a grip on violence in the public domain, which is underlying the whole prevention effort. So that is another problem, and it leads me to a reflection on your approach, where I say I don't know, because you put technology there, but I think I would like to see more discussion of the role of media, rather media of communication in large system approach, and what it can do both in positive and in negative ways, because it can go both ways, I think.
Excellent.
So for me, that's another issue that I would like to contribute to the discussion, so to say.
Almost the mediating influences between these different spheres of change.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, moving on. There's also, I think what is problematic, there's a decrease in move towards collective values. I think, our post-World War II, we have seen, of course, the whole Bretton Woods system, the idea of human rights. We work in certain regions of the world where the whole idea of human rights simply doesn't work, defined as such. So there's a breakup. So it makes it more difficult. Not when it comes to the basics of nobody is in favor of violence. Yeah, everybody would want to prevent violence. That is pretty much a commonality. That is something that you can enter the spheres, the corridors of power, whether it is in China or in Washington or whatever. But the broader sort of the idea that we were moving towards a more unified sense of collective norms is weaker now, in my view, than it has been before. And if you wish, the darkest side of that is an increase in crime and criminal governance, which means that a lot of economic interaction, social interaction is organized on the basis of criminal premises, and that is highly problematic when it comes to developing a preventive approach. Because, of course, there is a fundamental difference if you deal with it, whether it's an individual or a group of people, where you say, well, let's say like the Tuareg Somali, just to come back to that as an example, there is, you know, they are violent or threatening to be violent, but there is an underlying grievance that needs to be seriously addressed, right? That is a legitimate grievance. That is one thing. It's another thing if you deal with people who are violent in an organized way, and where, yeah, you deal with criminals. I mean, people that belong in jail. From a public perspective, that requires a very different approach. And because also crime, and I use, of course, on purpose the term criminal governance, is so dispersed, increasingly in transnational networks, it is a great problem that is crisscrossing a nice large system approach, because you deal with people who are not at all interested in any normative statement or whatever, who are only interested in their own interest, and it's highly problematic. It's highly problematic.
The archetypical example, I guess, is ISIS today, and one of the responses has been to try to create this international court, which, of course, has all of these limitations. But I guess is that a correct way to think of these, this key problem 3 in terms of ISIS as an example?
Well, the International Criminal Court is you know, it's at the end of the street where I live, so. It is rather, you know, I think the idea of that is, for me, is more to promote prevention and effective justice in different countries, rather than that will be the solution to this sort of thing. It's the last resort of something, you know. It's not going to be the panacea for all of these problems. Okay, and finally, in another issue that makes prevention problematic is what I, again, for the sake of, to be brief, I call the economy of politics. You know, the politics are dominated, and probably more so even than they have always been at the moment, by short-term interest, short-term looking. There's no long-term accountability. You know, it's the next election is as far as we can look, whereas prevention often needs and requires a longer term perspective. It requires thinking about, okay, this society, this region of the world, what are we going to do with it, you know, in the next 5 to 10 years at least? And the political systems are not very suitable for that. Another question I want to bring in here, because in what I've read from the large system approach, you do not seem to make differences between different, in that sense, geographic parts of the world. I'm wondering, also working globally, whether East Asia is a little different in this regard. To me, this is part, you're coming back to the example of human rights, and let's just zoom in on China, but you can expand this to Japan and the Koreas and so on. That you know, if Amnesty International comes in with its human rights critique on China, then to me it's wrong to see that just at the level of, oh, China is upset because they are, etc. It's more like, it's not that China has no eye for some of the human rights critique of Amnesty, but what they're basically saying is, look, we're at another stage of our development. We're at another moment in, you know, and we want to arrive at what you are suggesting, but give us another 10 years. That's, I think, where a lot of the irritation comes from in that debate. In my view, and also see how the governments work, the governments in East Asia have a longer term time perspective. You could, of course, immediately say, yeah, that's because they're not democratically controlled. So, that gives them the luxury of a longer term perspective. But I think there's a cultural difference, which I think is relevant to bring into the discussion on large system change, because that leads you to, okay, where are your allies in some of these debates if you try to innovate relationships, if you try to identify where to expect or strengthen new leadership, for example.
Peter, these are, I really appreciate the way you're expanding the questions around the large system change approach. I'm wondering, given the time we have left, if
I think I'm almost done. Yeah, I'm sorry. I know I'm throwing a lot on the table, but your approach is inviting that.
It is indeed. I'm just wondering if we might ask Mark, Mark Clark, since he's dealing with these issues from a very different perspective, which is sort of a village cultural meme perspective, if some of his reflections on what we've heard up to now, just because I think it's a very interesting thing that you're taking this big picture about the institutions and the relationships with civil society and etc. And Mark is dealing with violence, but it's with a very different issue. So I'm just wondering, Mark, if you might join, turn on your audio and just give us any reflections you have.
Yes, firstly, Peter, thank you very much. I'm learning a lot from your presentation, and the work you're doing is incredibly powerful and I think really valuable. But as Steve said, it's really at a very different level to our work. I guess we're working at very small scale, at very local level, at grassroots in communities, and I'm fascinated by the potential of what we're exploring with large systems change and global action networks to see what really could be possible to make these linkages between levels. I mean, it's great to see a network such as GPPAC that is already connecting many civil society organizations focused on peace building, conflict transformation, rights-based approaches, and so on. And Generations for Peace doesn't yet belong to GPPAC or any similar network. And I think one of the reasons we're not a member of such a network is we recognize that it does take some investment of time and energy to maximize the returns on membership. And I think that's putting us off at the moment, simply because we're incredibly busy with our own sort of our noses in the trough, and we're busy at our very small scaling communities. So how would you respond to that? You've obviously persuaded many other civil society organizations to lift their heads above their everyday work and to see the benefits of networking, notwithstanding that it requires an investment of energy.
Well, thanks, Mark, and I completely appreciate the question. This is exactly what we're debating. It's one reason why we've kept, I think, the entry into GPPAC low. There's no fee. There's no, you can also, it's almost like in a political party, you can also be a sleeping member. Yeah. Because we like, the first thing is to have the connection and at least to create the possibility to exchange information.
Yes.
And for us, we try to establish a level of knowledge that we'd like to share as broadly as possible. You're right that, of course, if you want to, become more active, like in anything, there is a trade-off. And I recognize very much what you say. This is actually what a lot of our members are saying. Look, our priority is, we have our hands full with our local situation. And so it's also, that's the job that we try to do in the Global Secretariat, is on the one hand to create opportunities where you minimize the claim on time and resources of people to help doing something. And yeah, to say to make, this is the challenge, of course, in our work, to make that translation from local to global levels and back again, because the loop needs to be complete. But you're welcome, you know, to participate with all the unevenness and the wobbliness that our network has. Let's say it is possible to join GPPAC at a fairly low energy level, and that is fine, I would say. But to be able to you know, if I hear about your work, I would be curious to learn more about your work, and the good news on the other hand is that in my experience, this part of civil society is not as big as the development community or the environmental groups or whatever. There's a few networks, so it's still a bit more manageable than some other parts of civil society. So I do hope that we will be able to generate that energy, because the important thing is, and where I hope the larger system type of discussions will help us, is precisely to address that question that you asked, Mark, that we need to be able to explain to people that it makes sense, you know, to talk to the African Union, or it makes sense to go to New York and make your case, because there is so much skepsis about it. You know, there is so much skepsis about all of these organizations. But we can only make them work if we go the extra mile and try to reform them and try to get a seat at the table. So my take on it is also, I'm trying to write a paper about it, that I think as civil society we should go further. We should be willing to participate and share more even in the responsibility for prevention, and really institutionalize our role there, because governments cannot do it alone anymore.
So this is wonderful. This is exactly, I think, part of the large system change we're experiencing is the evolution of the globality of citizenship, and finding ways to evolve that. I mean, that is, you know, at one point, sort of the big challenge here. So that's exactly what I was hoping people would, on participating in this webinar, would hear. This is the type of discussion that is happening, right, about how we move ahead on this complex globality issue too, recognizing that the globe is nothing without the local.
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So here, well, I think this was my final space, right? It's a slide, the way for, I think, so looking towards forms of multi-stakeholder governance, and we need to rethink political processes and values and identities. I think that's where it resonates actually with the points you were just making, Steve. We're looking at countries where there is increasing numbers of people with clutched identities, and the whole refugee migration crisis that's going on as we speak is compounding that, is showing, of course, the risk and the tensions in our societies, but is also showing and sort of, it's almost like establishing a fait accompli that, you know, if I just limit myself to my own country, that soon enough in the Netherlands there will be big chunks of people that are born in another country that have, yes, they will be Dutch, they will be citizens of the Netherlands, but they have family, probably a piece of land and a bank account also in another country, and so people have double or triple identities, and it poses whole new questions in how to connect the politics with values. And the politics is the first sphere where we need to define processes that can constrain violence, because that's where I'm coming from. Violence in the public domain is always terrible for people. It is terrible. You know, that is really my one and only motivation.